Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2019 McMullen Sea Power discussion. This is part of the 2019 McMullen Sea Power Symposium, which is the largest naval history conference. Well, I was going to say the largest one in North America, but with 400 registrants, historians from all over the world, I think we're probably the largest naval history conference anywhere in the world as of this year. I will make a note that this event is beginning now at 1900. Study hour for our midshipmen begins at 2000. The midshipmen are permitted to leave if they would like to once 2000 comes. Please do it quietly, but the Q&A may continue after that point. You are also welcome to stay. Today we have a very interesting panel. We are going to have a discussion with two former flag officers, including Admiral Jonathan Greenert, our former CNO, and three noted historians talking about CNOs of the past. And now I'll introduce our panel chair, Vice Admiral Frank Pandolf, PhD. Vice Admiral Pandolf graduated with distinction from the U.S. Naval Academy with the class of 1980. He later earned a doctorate in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. At sea, he commanded the USS Mitcher, Destroyer Squadron 18, Carrier Strike Group 2, Naval Striking Support Forces NATO, and the U.S. 6th Fleet. Ashore, he served in the White House, the United Nations, the Joint Staff, and the Navy Staff. He was Director for Strategic Plans and Policy in the J5 and military advisor to the Secretary of State. Vice Admiral Pandolf retired from the active duty in 2017 after 37 years of commissioned service. Admiral Pandolf.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening, making time in your busy day to join us. I heard it was a great day with lots of great lectures, and we'll hopefully conclude the day with an interesting panel for you here tonight. Especially like to thank Admiral Buck for attending this evening. Sean, congratulations again on your new assignment. I can think of no officer more qualified to lead our academy than you. And T.R. Buchanan is here, who is an old friend of mine. You know you're getting on when you knew the Dot when he was a lieutenant. So I would also like to thank Commander Armstrong for organizing the event tonight. It takes a lot of work to put on a symposium like this. And Commander Armstrong, you and your shipmates deserve a lot of credit for doing a great job with the week before us. Okay, well, we're in for a real treat this evening. We're going to hear from three esteemed historians who will review with us the professional accomplishments and the human traits of three of our greatest American naval leaders, Admirals King, Burke, and Zumwalt. Admiral King graduated from Annapolis with the class of 1901. He actually earlier had experienced combat by volunteering for service in the Spanish-American War as a midshipman. He was 63 years old when he became the Chief of Naval Operations in 1941, and he guided our Navy to its greatest victory during World War II, retiring in 1945 after 44 years of commissioned service. Admiral Burke was born in 1901, the same year that King graduated. Admiral Burke was the class of 23. His life-defining experiences were a product of the intense combat of the South Pacific during the Second World War. Admiral Burke became CNO in 1955 when President Eisenhower promoted him from Rear Admiral to 4 stars over 92 more senior flag officers. He was 54 years old at the time. Admiral Zumwalt graduated from the Naval Academy in 1942. He served in World War II as well, but as a junior officer. When he was promoted by President Nixon to become CNO in 1970, he was chosen over 33 more senior flag officers. Admiral Zumwalt was only 50 years old at the time, 4 years younger than Burke and 13 years younger than King when they assumed the office. Viewed as a continuum, King led our Navy through the global war of the 1940s. Burke guided us through the Cold War of the 1950s and into the 1960s. And Zumwalt fought the war in Vietnam, while struggling to update our Navy's culture in view of the profound social changes of the 1970s. These were three very different men, forged by powerful experiences, some shared, some not, who assumed leadership of our Navy at different ages in different eras. Yet together, they shaped the Navy we have today, and I look forward to hearing more about them from this panel this evening. And to do that, we have three presenters and one commentator. First, Dr. David Koenen will speak. He is the director of the Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research at the U.S. Naval War College. He earned his PhD in history from King's College in London, and most recently has completed a major study of Admiral King that soon will be published. Next, we will hear from a great friend of many of ours here tonight, Dr. David Rosenberg. David is a project leader at the Institute for Defense Analysis. He has had a storied career in government, academia, and various think tanks. He is the world's foremost expert on Admiral Burke. Dr. Rosenberg earned his PhD from the University of Chicago. We then will hear from Dr. Edward Marolda, who will talk about Admiral Bud Zumwalt. Dr. Marolda has served as Director of Naval History and Senior Historian of the Navy in Washington, D.C. He is finishing up a book on Navy leaders during the Vietnam War. Dr. Marolda earned his doctorate from George Washington University. Finally, we'll hear commentary from Admiral Jonathan Greenert, our 30th CNO. Admiral Greenert graduated with the class of 1975. He served as Chief of Naval Operations from 2011 through 2015 and guided us into the post-Cold War era. I believe CNO Greenert's direction to our Navy to keep warfighting first, operating forward, and be ready remains the best and most succinct description of our Navy's mission that I have ever heard. Admiral Greenert will share some thoughts about what he has heard, as well as some thoughts on how the Office of the CNO has evolved over the years, particularly in light of the landmark 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Koenen, who will tell us about the legendary Admiral King.
That picture was taken in 1944. The Navy that you see on the horizon was not constructed in 1941. The person who built that Navy was none other than Ernest J. King during the context of the Second World War. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the Second World War, but first I want to introduce you to this really striking individual in our history. In very broad strokes, I will examine the experience of U.S. Navy Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King. As a five-star admiral, he had rights that continued until his death in 1956. In other words, he had an office in the Navy Department. He did retire for medical reasons, but in actual fact, he continued in active service to his death. That's a unique facet of the five-star admirals of the Second World War. I will also focus my analysis today on the influence of history upon the command philosophy of King. From 1941 to 1945, King held unprecedented authority as the Chief of Naval Operations and simultaneously as Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, roughly equivalent to our contemporary Fleet Forces Command. King stood among the few to achieve five-star rank, and no other American, no other naval officer in history has carried such responsibility in wartime. Like many of us, King grew up in the industrial Rust Belt of the Midwest during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. The son of a thrifty Scottish immigrant, he joined the American Naval Service when Britannia still ruled the waves and waved the rules as it suited Britannia. His only direct combat experience happened as a midshipman at the Naval Academy. He volunteered for service in the Spanish-American War. His Naval Academy class was the last to receive formal training in the ropes of the Age of Sail. So he actually learned how to sail sailing ships. But it was personal experience in the First World War which really influenced King's philosophy as a strategic thinker and an operational planner. He learned those tools under Admiral Henry T. Mayo of Vermont. Among other triumphs, Mayo asked King, as the fleet engineer, to figure out how to get those destroyers over to Queenstown as quickly as possible. And as the fleet engineer, Ernest J. King met up with the XO of the USS Maumee. And in the spring of 1917, that XO of the Maumee and Ernest J. King figured out how to do underway replenishment in waters that were infested with German submarines. That XO was none other than Lieutenant Commander Chester W. Nimitz. Mayo entrusted King also to serve as the Atlantic Fleet liaison officer to the, quote, London flagship headquarters of King's other mentor, Vice Admiral William S. Sims. Earlier, King had served with Sims in the Atlantic Fleet destroyer flotilla. He developed close connections during that experience with none other than the future CNO Harold Rainford Stark, as well as a guy named William F. Bill Halsey, Jr. To understand the decisions that are made in the heat of combat in the Second World War, you have to start with these people. You have to understand them as personalities, and you also have to understand how they knew each other. Their friendships over many, many decades proved crucial in the heat of the Second World War. King also witnessed firsthand as Sims pioneered what we would call today a combined maritime component commander. There was no rule book or doctrine for how to integrate U.S. naval forces in the context of a coalition. They had to make it up. So this experience in the First World War, of course, is influencing how King sees future combined operations. Reflecting on the problems experienced by Sims and Mayo as fleet commanders and nominally as maritime component commanders, King looked at the first CNO, who was also blazing new trails. King criticized the CNO, Benson, for, quote, trying to run everything himself. His concern over minute details would lose control of the general picture. King developed a very strong distaste for micromanagers as a result of this experience. His friend Dudley Knox said, if King had his way, he would find ways to make people do things that he otherwise wouldn't do himself. Although King supported combat operations, the wine and cheese luncheons with monarchs and chateau generals arguably had a greater influence upon the strategic perspective of Ernest J. King. He learned about the art of diplomacy. Mayo entrusted King to be his eyes and ears on the European front for the Atlantic Fleet in Europe. There, King also first met Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur said to King that an Army officer should command all naval operations in the war zone, to which King replied, only if that Army officer can walk on water. In coordinating combined operations, King warily observed the Admiralty staff as they struggled to focus on the key strategic war objectives while also trying to maintain their global British Empire. It became a question of resources. King also, during this experience, developed a lasting friendship with his friend Dudley Pound, who during the Second World War would serve as First Sea Lord. To do their jobs, Pound freely shared information derived from high-grade British intelligence sources with King, his American counterpart. Historians have generally missed the fact that Pound and King established a long personal friendship that paid dividends during the Second World War. His papers include Christmas cards that were exchanged between these gentlemen during the interwar period. Among the key conclusions that King came home with after the First World War, King considered imperial occupations of global land areas ashore unsustainable from a military perspective. On this point, King thought that the Royal Navy had gotten bogged down so much that they relied so heavily, quote, upon a global network of global land bases
which proved vulnerable and required defensive land and air forces to maintain them. King thought that the British suffered from strategic atrophy as they wasted resources and acted in defensive terms about their global empire. He thought that naval bases ashore actually sapped resources from the fleet at sea, which he believed destroyed mobility and also distracted Allied commanders from focusing on the destruction of the enemy at hand. As the First World War sputtered to an end with the armistice in November of 1918, King remembered participating in a celebratory party held aboard the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet, USS Pennsylvania. King sat with his friend Pound. Following dinner, another British officer stood up and wanted to give a toast. He said, quote, "The United States should join the British Commonwealth so as to produce a union that could resist any future attack." In response, King stood up and endorsed the idea by toasting the Royal Navy and suggesting that, quote, "the capital of this reconstituted empire should be in Washington, D.C." King attained the nickname Boy Captain for making the temporary wartime rank as Atlantic Fleet Chief of Staff by the ripe old age of 39 years old. Following the flags of Sims and Mayo, the problem of professional naval education inspired King to be the lead author in the infamous Knox-Pye-King Report, or KPK Report, in which he suggested that the highest-ranking officers of the U.S. Navy had only been educated at the Naval Academy to the lowest commissioned grade. Putting his words to his own example, King set about to set the example for other officers. King graduated 3 times from the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, first from the staff course in 1916, then in 1924, and again in the senior resident course in 1933. Of note, among the 84 flag officers listed in the Navy Register of 1941, only 2 had failed to complete advanced studies at the Naval War College. Beyond the classroom setting, King studied the naval leaders and campaigns of the past as part of his own personal development. This work informed his leadership philosophy, which a friend described King as knowing the art of, quote, "never doing the same mistake that Napoleon made." I think it resonates with the words that he delivered when he took command of the aircraft carrier Lexington when you think about his leadership philosophy. All things are equal for King. He says to his crew, quote, "all hands should be prepared for war," King growled in his Midwestern accent. "The youngest and most inexperienced sailor on board is just as important as I am as your commander. The sharks don't care about rank. So I shall do my part, and you are expected to do yours with equal zest." According to the young communications officer in USS Lexington in the 1930s, Lieutenant Robert Heinlein observed that King was training admirals. One way or another, he always got rid of the misfits, unquote. Poor behavior instantly drew King's wrath, as Heinlein recalled shipmates in trouble being notionally, quote, "skinned alive with a dull knife. I bet they still have nightmares about it." The consummate naval professional, King recognized his peacetime responsibility for setting the standards in order to prepare the U.S. Navy for war. He rejected bureaucratic orthodoxy. He gained a reputation for being a maverick among senior officers. Much to their chagrin, King twice bombed Pearl Harbor during exercises in 1932 and 1938. Later, he riled counterparts in the U.S. Army during the joint amphibious exercises involving the first use of LSTs during the Flex exercises during 1939. Among friends, King famously had a dry sense of humor, and he enjoyed listening to Gene Autry while reading history books. When in command, King studied historical figures in order to act the part of a leader expecting subordinates and superiors to do just the same. He expected them to set, not meet, standards. His friend, Commodore Dudley Knox, said that King studied history such that he could recount the, quote, biographies of all of Napoleon's marshals and Lee's lieutenants. King appreciated mythology, but he also understood that Horatio Nelson and John Paul Jones provided examples of leadership from a historical perspective. His study of history enabled King to distinguish the differences between military operations and naval operations. Influenced by the ideas of an earlier age of Admiral Stephen B. Luce and the Naval War College of a bygone era, King thought, quote, all naval operations are strategic, whether peace or war. Breaking from the British imperial traditions of maritime strategy, King trained the Navy to operate with limited access to land bases ashore. He argued in one of his many Naval War College papers, often, quote, often the determining element in naval strategy is logistics. Naval strategy is concerned and emphasizes the importance of what are known as lines of communication. King recognized the perspective and influence of he recognized the influence of technical innovations such as electronic communications, submarines, and aircraft carriers, and he did stand out as being one of only 3 American admirals at the dawn of the Second World War who earned the status of being triple threats, with qualifications in submarines, aviation, and of course, surface warfare. He qualified as an aviator at the age of 49 years old. I stand before you as a 49-year-old, and I don't know how he would have done that. Based upon his study of history, King gained such a perspective that he recognized that the influence of technology is always a variable. He said, things which have arisen from time to time by reason of the evolution of weapons and the advent of new degrees of mobility and maneuver, he warned about the, quote, false assumption about progress in technology. Considering the interrelationships of strategy and technology, King took the humanistic approach in considering the nexus between peace and war. King warned fellow Americans that our, quote, altruism and our strong inclination to play, quote, citizen fix-it, have combined to involve us much more deeply than is necessary or desirable, even though initially not intended. Among FDR's favorite admirals, King received the difficult mission of executing the strategy of naval neutrality in 1941. King issued orders to his subordinates to stop micromanaging and to quit complaining about the limited resources available, with the directive, make the best with what you have, which I've put up on the screen for you. Within 10 days following the Pearl Harbor disaster, Roosevelt sent the most junior flag officer in the Navy, Nimitz, out to Hawaii while simultaneously dragooning the elder King at 63 years of age to command global U.S. naval forces as Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. Among his first actions, King changed the title on his business card from Sincus, as it was pronounced in the Navy, to Commench. He didn't think that Sincus sounded just right after Pearl Harbor. Shouldered with unprecedented global responsibility by June of 1942 under an executive order, King held both offices of CNO and Commench. That's like merging today's Fleet Forces Command with the office of the CNO. In this capacity, King had to balance the expectation of allies. In June of 1942, he went to London to brief Winston Churchill on the preliminary plans to deal with operations in the Pacific with simultaneous offensive operations in Europe. During this period, Winston Churchill said we should go to Norway, we should go to Africa, we should go liberate Italy, we should help the Russians, we should retake Singapore. King said, "Sir, we can't do it." Mr. Churchill, quote unquote, had an army view of the world and did not like the word logistics. Churchill insisted that the King's English had no such word. Whenever King used the term, Churchill always barked back, "Logistics? What is that?" King refused to allow Churchill and other British strategists to assume their supremacy in relations with the Americans. As in the First World War, King remembered how the British used American forces as an adjunct to the Royal Navy. In the context of the Second World War, he wrote a letter to his friend Stark. He said, quote, "The seeming helplessness of our cousins strikes me as amusing when it's not annoying. I'm sure that when they wish in their hearts is that we would haul down the stars and stripes and hoist the white ensign on all of our ships. I cannot be expected to agree to help them cling to tasks that they themselves are unable to do unless we lend them our ships and our forces." Given our limited time, I am unable to properly, in sufficient detail, go through the complicated and largely forgotten role of Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King in managing the global war at sea of the Second World War. However, I will say that Ernest J. King particularly had a very strategic view of what was required. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park famously developed means to track the Axis enemy. Yet they were unable to do the job alone, so King built his own intelligence capability at Nebraska Avenue. His Combat Intelligence Division, meanwhile, drove the operations of the numbered fleets, which are also an invention of Ernest J. King. After 1943, the combined forces of the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy arguably were a King's Navy in the Second World War. And so with these very brief observations, I will close by offering the following from the First Sea Lord after Dudley Pound died. Andrew Cunningham recalled Ernest King as a man of immense capability and ability. Quite ruthless in his methods, he was not an easy person to get along with, but on the whole, I think Ernie King was the right man in the right place. Not content with fighting the enemy, he was usually fighting someone on his own side as well. Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook, who shared a similar position as King, recalled epic and poisonous fights with King, given the differing objectives of Churchill's vision of reestablishing the British Empire versus FDR's utopian vision of a United Nations. The two are not the same. Allenbrook lauded the tough and stubborn King, the old crustacean, as one of his countrymen called him, the ablest strategist on the American Chiefs of Staff. Fighting for the post-war peace, King warned fellow Americans about the fallacy of strategic air power as we slipped into the ease of a Cold War. He explained the fundamental differences between military and naval operations. Military strategy remained different from maritime strategy, as navies historically remained operationally relevant in both peace and war. On this point, King rejected the ideas of a Department of Defense and a separate U.S. Air Force. In closing, having somehow had the time to maintain a close-knit and very happy family of 7 children, 14 grandchildren, and an extended family comprised of 2 flag officers of the U.S. Army and, surprisingly, a 4-star Air Force general, Fleet Admiral Ernest King was a devoted father who relied upon his Navy wife, Maddie, who dutifully kept the watch at home throughout his singular career spanning 5 decades. Given his service in 2 world wars, King was also, perhaps ironically, a man of peace. In a final address before a stroke took his voice in 1947, King observed, quote, "No matter how ingenious the war machines, no matter how marvelous the developments of science, we must always remember that the wars of the future, if more wars there must be, will be similar to the wars of the past," unquote. Looking outward to the future, the elder King thought, quote, "We must, if you like, paraphrase the phrase waging war. Why should we not make as much effort to win the peace as we do to win the war? why should we not wage peace? Thank you.
Good evening. This picture is from the cover of Collier's magazine in October 1951. But what it also represents is the picture that Admiral Arleigh Burke, as Chief of Naval Operations, signed to all the members of his staff. And you can imagine that when they left as CNO, he wanted them to remember that stare over the pipe to understand just the kind of demands he put on them. Arleigh Burke served as Chief of Naval Operations for 6 years, longer than any other man. However, he's well remembered in the U.S. Navy for being the Navy's greatest destroyerman. The Arleigh Burke class of destroyers, the largest class of surface combatants built since the Second World War, and the Arleigh Burke itself is named for him. His greatest victory, Cape St. George, is commemorated in an Aegis cruiser. And on top of it, his old command, Destroyer Squadron 23, carries on the traditions of the Little Beavers. For those of you who have been to Yokosuka, Japan, you also know that the Officers Club in Yokosuka is named for him. And I can tell you that he was in some ways most proud of that. He felt it was perhaps the most appropriate honor that he had in fact received. I'm going to talk to you about Arleigh Burke tonight. I'm going to talk to you about what, in fact, factors helped to make him and shape both his character and his capability as a naval officer. And I'm going to talk to you as well about the things that he accomplished as CNO that left a legacy for the United States Navy that stay with us today. Some of these things will be at the cutting edge of declassification. No one need worry. These things have all been documented and taken care of well ahead of time, dealing with such esoteric things as space, unconventional warfare, and submarines. Arleigh Burke was born, as Admiral Pandolf noted, in October 19th, 1901, in Boulder, Colorado. He was a farm boy. He came to the United States Naval Academy in 1919, never having graduated high school. One of two things he actually shared with Fleet Admiral Nimitz, the other one being never having served as a vice admiral. Burke came to the Naval Academy without having graduated high school because of the flu epidemic of 1918-1919. He graduated with the class of 1923. On June 7th, married his sweetheart, Roberta Gorsuch, the same day, and headed off to the USS Arizona. During his time at the Naval Academy, he came to conclude that he, in fact, enjoyed competing in an institution in which the rules were strict, known, and obeyed. And this was a line that he carried forward in terms of thinking about the Navy from then on. He also learned something that was taught to him in leadership at the Naval Academy, the importance of loyalty, particularly not just to country and to Navy, but loyalty up and loyalty down, mainly because of the importance of that. The American sailor, being not born of rank or caste, only was going to get that out of mutual respect. When he went to the USS Arizona, on which he served for 5 years, he did a number of things on the battleship, but fell in love with the practice of gunnery, aided by his gunnery officer who had taught him at the Naval Academy, Commander Andrew Denny. Denny also taught him to do the best job he could, even if it was the worst and most filthy job possible, like cleaning Arizona's double bottoms. Denny inspired him to look ahead, to join the gun club of the Bureau of Ordnance, and to be part of that institution. By doing so, he would in fact go on and get postgraduate work in ordnance here at the Naval Academy, then at the University of Michigan with a master's degree in chemical engineering, and then time with all sorts of ordnance specialties. These prepared him for what are generally overlooked as being major leadership opportunities as a lieutenant. One, to be the assistant and officer in charge of the fleet camera party. Oh yeah, movies. No, he was recording and reporting on fleet target practice, some of the most sensitive operations a peacetime Navy could carry out, reporting on how well we did. which we were getting better at. The next year, 2 years later, he went off to Washington to the Bureau, where he ended up running all of the ammunition section as a lieutenant for the entire Navy. Now, Destroyer-man Burke doesn't get to destroyers until 14 years after he graduated the Naval Academy. He's XO of the new destroyer Craven, and then takes command of the destroyer Mugford. It was in command of the Mugford that he fell in love with destroyers, won the Fleet Gunnery Trophy, and had an impression pushed on him by his division commander, a watchword that Burke always used, and told Admiral Whiting this later after the war. "You told me if you've got power, use it and use it fast, and the time to make a decision is as soon as the problem presents itself." This led Burke, among other things, to in fact say that the difference between a successful officer and an unsuccessful one was 10 seconds. During World War II, Burke spent the first 2.5 years of World War II as a gun mount inspector at the Washington Navy Yard and the gun factory. Navy paid for his master's degree. Buord took its pound of flesh. He comes out to command a destroyer division, then another, then a squadron. In the course of it, he spends time studying the Guadalcanal campaign, the disastrous night actions. And by the time he'd been in command of his first division for 2 months, he came up with what he called the doctrine of faith, where, involving delegation, that would mean that the destroyer commander supporting cruisers would have the license from his commander to go off and undertake independent operations using the advantage of radar and voice radio, and on top of it, torpedoes to carry out a first attack against the enemy. His boss at the time, Rear Admiral Tip Merrill, allowed him to go ahead and develop that, but he didn't get a chance to use it until he came back to work for Merrill 6 months later in command of Destroyer Squadron 23, where he used it successfully at the battles of Empress Augusta Bay and Cape St. George. Now, what was going to happen to then Captain Burke? He was going to go back to the Bureau of Ordnance. Fortunately, Vice Admiral Mark Mitzer, the commander of the fast carriers, decided that he needed a combat commander as his chief of staff after Ernest J. King decided that it would be a good idea for surface officers to have aviator chiefs of staff and vice versa. Admiral Mitzer brought him in, and what transpired as a result was the fact that Burke learned the birdman's lingo and learned how to operate forces and became fully cognizant of the use of intelligence. All of this provided a foundation for him for the post-war period, but the finishing touches came in 2 different ways. One, his time in Washington, in the period of unification and the battles over armed services roles and missions. During this time, Burke was a major player in this, and in 1949 orchestrated Navy testimony before the House Armed Services Committee in what we called the Unification and Strategy hearings, but what time called the Revolt of the Admirals. The Navy did very well making its point, but Captain Burke was taken off the promotion list by the Secretary of the Navy, Francis Matthews, and the Secretary of Defense, Louis Johnson. It took the intercession of Robert Dennison, his classmate and President Truman's naval aide, and Admiral Forrest Sherman to convince President Truman to put him back on that list. But it taught Burke a lesson he'd already been feeling because of what the Birdmen were doing commanding the Navy in terms of the humility dealing with naval aviators, which many of us have experienced. Anyway, the next major experience was when he became Admiral Sherman's personal representative in Commander for Naval Forces Far East at the start of the Korean War, where he did and led much of the strategic planning for Incheon, and then after the Chinese intervened, something that Burke had warned against, dealing with the retreat, the Chosin Reservoir campaign, and so forth. But it was really in the summer and fall of 1951 that the final lesson came through to him. He was part of the first UN truce negotiating team, where for 5 months he sat across from North Korean and Communist Chinese generals as battles were fought and men died, many men died, over small yards and feet of ground. And as Burke came away with this, Limited wars were critical, and the only things the communists understood were power. Arleigh Burke was picked by Dwight David Eisenhower as Chief of Naval Operations over 92 senior admirals. This is because Eisenhower was not happy with, not Eisenhower, the Secretary of the Navy, Charles Thomas, was not happy with the information he was receiving from the CNO. And he also felt that Admiral Carney, a mentor of Admiral Burke's, was not moving fast enough on technology. As a result, what transpired is he told Burke that he had to move fast. Now, normally, a new CNO coming in with so many senior folks above him would have cleaned house, would have reorganized OpNav. Burke did not. He kept the same vice chief who'd been there since '51, the same executive assistant, and largely stayed in the same organization that had been started by Ernest J. King. In fact, he discovered something that he reported on later. He noted that in order to get things done as CNO, quote, "It's not wise of me to give a direct order, because if I do, I must do my damnedest to make sure it is carried out. What I try to do is to call the action officers up to my office. This causes some complications right away because I bypass people, but if the action officer is alert and enthusiastic and he believes it should be done, it will get done because he will follow through and do the checking." A remarkably interesting approach to leadership. Burke's approach to all of this was based on a philosophy. We believe in command, not staff. We believe we have real things to do. The Navy believes in putting a man in a position with a job to do and let him do it. Give him hell if he does not perform, but be a man in his own name. We decentralize and capitalize on the capabilities of our individual people rather than centralize and make automatons of them. This builds that essential pride of service and sense of accomplishment. If it results in a certain amount of cockiness, I am for it. This is the direction in which we should move. Burke was the last chief of naval operations to command the fleets. He was able to maneuver the fleets, Atlantic, Pacific, and naval forces, Eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean, during many major crises, including Suez, Lebanon, Indonesia, Taiwan, and later issues over Berlin in 1959. The key issue, though, was the fact that he felt he could still command them. As he said when he, in fact, moved the forces in the Mediterranean in 1958, "I was responsible to the Joint Chiefs and to the President for the readiness and movement of the fleets. I followed Eisenhower and the JCS directives, but it was up to me to have the fleets positioned and ready for action whenever and wherever they were needed. So I moved the Sixth Fleet and made other necessary preparations, including reinforcing it for any emergency, or at least for some of them. Naturally, everybody was informed, but I did not have to wait until the end of weeks of debate before getting things ready. It was a very flexible command system in which action could be taken very fast. It was a centralized system." Burke believed in what was called the fellowship of the blue uniform. Burke made many strides in working with allies. He is considered the father of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force due to the things that came out of his experience working in Japan in 1950, 1951. He also built major connections with allied navies in both Europe, in Asia, in South America. His most lasting contribution was a decision he made in 1956 to establish the Naval Command Course at the Naval War College, where mid-grade and senior officers from foreign navies came to the Naval War College. That course continues to this day, and in many cases has produced senior leaders of those navies, including a couple of presidents, which we won't go into, of their respective nations. Dwight Eisenhower made the decision in 1958 that he was going to, in fact, remove the service chiefs from command of their services and make them a collective body. And this was something that if he did this, he was going to enhance the power of the Secretary of Defense, reduce the authority of the civilian military heads of the services, and direct control of operating forces would be transferred from the service chiefs to the President and the Secretary of Defense, where it in fact exists now. Burke opposed it. He fought very hard. He lost that command, But during the last 2 years of his time as CNO, he actually was able to exercise influence over planning and operations, despite that, in areas that only now are coming to light, such as suggesting in the event of a Berlin blockade by the Russians in 1959 that the United States Navy and Allied navies undertake a reciprocal effort at sea to shut down Soviet maritime commerce. We now know that plan existed as a special access plan all the way through 1990. We know it thanks to a German colonel who wrote about it and gave us the code names of the American fleet headquarters that dealt with that. Okay. Even as Burke was raising questions about the defense reorganization, he was in fact had developed a good relationship with President Eisenhower. I'm not sure how much of this you can read, but the key things that are there, if you look at it, is President Eisenhower sent him a bottle of Chivas Regal Scotch on the Navy's launching a Vanguard satellite. Burke's PAO sat down and wrote a draft letter indicating that he was going to getting progressively drunker. Burke actually signed a letter to his PAO's horror, and what happened is that it was sent to the president. What did Eisenhower do? He wrote back how much he appreciated it. Let me close with two things. One, the decisions that Burke made largely shaped the Navy we know today. He acted to develop and deploy a sea-based ballistic missile and nuclear submarines as a national deterrent system. He decided to make all submarines nuclear-powered based on the Albacore hull. He started a program in nuclear-powered surface ships that led to the USS Enterprise, USS Long Beach, and USS Bainbridge. He adopted the marine strategy of vertical envelopment for large-deck amphibious ships. He modernized naval aviation with new ships and new aircraft. He transformed surface warfare with support for surface-to-air missiles and, in at least an initial effort, to get surface-to-surface missiles. He championed investment in command and control, the Naval Tactical Data System that is the forerunner of Leak 16, and the sound surveillance system, now the undersea, integrated undersea surveillance system. He also pioneered three areas: space, submarines, and unconventional warfare. In space, in 1959, as satellites were getting started, he actually proposed a joint space agency under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first proposal for a joint space command, which fell on the inter-service arguments. He himself started the submarine surveillance program against the Soviet Union. By 1956, we know where U.S. submarines were: in the Barents, in the Norwegian Sea, off Murmansk, off Vladivostok, and off Petropavlovsk. We know this from a memo long declassified. We know that when Gerald Ford was briefed about those plans, that surveillance, he was told the same thing in 1974. Finally, Burke started an unconventional warfare effort in 1960, before the Kennedy administration started to emphasize guerrilla war, and he soon after, in 1961, argued for the need and demanded essentially a sense of where the Navy stood. Admiral Charles Weakley provided him with that list and proposed the name for those special mission operations units: SEALs. Burke is now considered Papa SEAL for that reason. Let me close with Burke himself. How the Navy should play its roles in national security. We have to work hard to maintain the Navy as a viable instrument of power which is needed by the United States, which is understood, and which can grow and change. We have to maintain in ourselves and imbue our juniors with an order to keep our country and our Navy in front. We must pass along a willingness to think hard, to seek new answers, to chance mistakes, and to mix it up freely in the forums and activities around us that promote knowledge. From that knowledge, we can inspire our country to have faith in us, not because the organization of the military forces is the only place to put our national faith, but because we have discharged our responsibilities in such a manner that we have justified confidence in the effective manner in which we operate. Thank you.
Good evening. I know this is getting late, so I'll keep my remarks to 40 minutes. Just kidding. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the name Elmo R. Zumwalt, Jr. Some of you midshipmen may soon be serving on board Zumwalt-class guided missile destroyers. He is probably known to more Americans than any other naval leader of the last 50 years. In many ways, he has achieved even legendary status. His sympathetic biographer has waxed poetic and compared him to, quote, Zorro fighting for the rights of oppressed men and women. Apparently, he slashes his enemies a Z on their chest. He is, as I said, a legendary figure in naval history, modern naval history. To honor Bud Zumwalt at his funeral here at the Naval Academy in your chapel, on January 10th, 2000, present were national leaders of the highest rank, including President and Mrs. Bill Clinton, Chairman of the JCS, Admiral McMullen, and hundreds of people whose lives he profoundly touched during his life and his service, including many veterans of the Vietnam War, both Americans and Vietnamese, and Rear Admiral Lillian Fishburne, the first black female flag officer. The heavens always seemed to shine for Admiral Zumwalt, and soon after the service began, the sun shined through the chapel stained glass windows. I was there, I saw it with my own eyes. So he had that way about him. President Clinton delivered the eulogy. He emphasized that the Admiral, quote, had the vision to see a great future for the Navy. He said that the changes the Admiral initiated, quote, will continue to shape the character and culture of the Navy into the 21st century. President Clinton identified or implied 4 of those leadership qualities that I plan to address tonight. Now, I should add that these were only 4 of his attributes. He had many more. Those 4 are a vision for the Navy of the future, the courage to advocate changes that he knew would generate lots of opposition in the service and also from the American people. 3, perseverance for the fight. He had to get his vision through and he had to pay a cost. He had to fight for it. And 4th, compassion for other human beings, not just Navy people, but Americans and indeed other human beings. He envisioned a Navy that treated all of its sailors with dignity and respect and provided them with the opportunity to excel, regardless of race, gender, religion, or national origin. He became the Chief of Naval Operations, as was mentioned earlier, over the heads of 33 other flag officers in July 1970 because, and this was unprecedented at that time, because Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird and Secretary of the Navy John Chafee really got involved directly and said, we want this guy, because they recognized and applauded his youth, his dynamism, and his identification with the welfare of enlisted sailors when he had served just previous to a CNR tour as commander of U.S. naval forces in Vietnam. They knew that from that experience. Zumwalt had objectives for his Navy of the future. He sought to modernize and reorient the fleet to counter the growing power and global influence of the Soviet Navy. The vehicle for his vision was entitled Project 60. He wanted to do it. The plan came out in 60 days after he became CNO. In Project 60, he proposed a more balanced fleet, which he called the high-low mix. It envisioned fewer nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, heresy at the time, and smaller sea control ships that were capable of operating vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. He also proposed hydrofoils, surface effect ships, surface-to-surface missiles, and other innovative platforms and weapons. He inaugurated a more direct means for transmitting his vision to the fleet, to the sailors of the fleat. These electronic communications, as most of you probably know, were called Z-grams, 120 of them. If any of you wants to see what each individual Z-gram was all about, the Naval History and Heritage Command has them online, Admiral Cox and company. They liberalized regulations on sideburns, beards, civilian clothing, and my favorite, ending long lines at the PX. Despite the common wisdom, he did not address equal opportunity for African Americans and until 6 months into his term, and did not address women for 2 years into his term. His primary objective was to improve the enlistment and retention of sailors, not to improve the lot of minorities. This was his initial approach. In 1970, only 9.5% of the sailors were re-enlisting after their first hitch. It had routinely been 35% before that. But he came to recognize that the seriousness of the long-standing racial and sexual discrimination that had been occurring in the Navy. It was unfortunately part of the tradition. In many ways, having a vision was the easy part. The hard part was translating his vision into results, and he needed extraordinary courage to bring that to fruition. Admirals King, as we've heard before, Admirals Nimitz, Arleigh Burke, Captain Arleigh Burke earlier, they achieved success in World War II because they were gifted military leaders. But they were also blessed with strong political leaders in Washington, the backing of the American people behind the war effort, and the resources needed to win. It was much harder for Zumwalt to excel as a leader when he had a president who several times threatened to fire him for one thing or another. We can talk about that in the Q&A. A population that had largely turned against the Vietnam War, and a Congress that limited funding for new ships, planes, and sailors' pay. Moreover, Zumwalt had to deal with the negative impact on the Navy from destabilizing changes in American society. Racial discord, drug abuse, anti-war and anti-establishment sentiment, and a host of other personnel and material ills plagued the service during and after the fighting. Admiral Thomas Moore and other naval aviators, Admiral Rickover and his submariners, and leading members of Congress opposed the central thrust of Zumwalt's high-low mix and shot down his sea control ship, which was the flagship of Project 60. But his perseverance kept alive many proposed weapon systems that eventually entered the fleet, such as the Oliver Hazard Perry frigates, which served for many years after that, Harpoon surface-to-surface missiles, Lamps helicopters, and the Sea Whiz close-in weapon system, and others. He did not shy away from the hard challenges of his vision. For instance, to strengthen the authority of the Chief of Naval Operations billet, Zumwalt took on Admiral Hyman Rickover, as many of you know, often referred to as the father of the nuclear navy. Zumwalt considered the powerful and legendary admiral a malady that afflicted the service because of his abrasive personality, close relationship with key members of Congress, you might even say incestuous, and statutory independence as the director of naval reactors working for the Atomic Energy Commission, a civilian agency. He wanted to retire Admiral Rickover, who had already served in uniform since the 1950s. He'd been on the job for quite a while. The CNO, however, ran into a buzzsaw of opposition from Congress and from submariners, and of course from the irascible Admiral Rickover. Not until Navy Secretary John Lehman revisited the issue a decade later did the service finally force out the 82-year-old flag officer. So Zumwalt didn't win that battle, but my point is that he did not shy away from a fight that he thought was righteous. Perhaps Zumwalt's biggest challenge was to change the Navy's culture. He was roundly criticized for his lack of fleet command experience, as we heard earlier, in contrast to that of his predecessor, Tom Moore, who had commanded the 7th Fleet, the Atlantic Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, became CNO and then chairman of the Joint Chiefs. At one point, all of the former CNOs, including Arleigh Burke, advised Zumwalt to slow down. You're going too fast. This is too radical. Many senior chief petty officers resented his Z-gram approach, which they believed bypassed them in the chain of command. It was going directly to the sailors, bypassing the chiefs, the admirals, and the rest. Powerful congressmen, some of them from the Deep South, lambasted Zumwalt in hearings on Capitol Hill for his disturbance of the racial status quo. Perhaps his most senior critic was President Richard Nixon, who has served as a naval officer in World War II. He railed about what Zumwalt was doing to destroy his Navy. Despite the heated opposition from many quarters, Zumwalt persevered in his quest. He did not achieve all that he wanted to with regard to personnel reforms or his other initiatives, but he changed the Navy's culture forever, and his successors helped fulfill his vision. John Lehman observed that the attitudes towards African Americans and women in the Navy that he inherited in 1981 were as healthy as in any other American institution at the time. Still had problems, but it was markedly better. I don't want to leave you with the impression that Zumwalt walked on water. He was a human being like the rest of us, and he made mistakes, many mistakes. He could be devious, blunt, arrogant, self-promoting, and dismissive of contrary arguments. But Elmo Zumwalt truly cared about the welfare of his fellow Americans, and especially the men and women of the Navy. From September 1968 to July 1970, as I mentioned earlier, he served as commander of the 38,000 naval personnel fighting in-country in Vietnam. The stories are legion of his flights to fire bases that had been attacked the night before to pin medals on deserving sailors. When a plane load of Navy casualties landed, the admiral was often on hand to go visit the hospital to see if they were taken care of. The sentiment was common. Every Vietnam veteran I've ever talked to, Pete can attest to that, Pete Schwartz, they loved him because they would fight for him to the last man, and they saw him as a great humanitarian. That's an important point. Tom Kelly, he's a Medal of Honor recipient from Vietnam, badly injured, his face shows that. He was severely wounded, and he went to Zumwalt for help. He said, the Navy wanted to medically discharge me. They want to kick me out. Zumwalt said, don't worry about it. And he took care of it, and Kelly served another 20 years in the Navy. As another example of Zumwalt's human touch, he had multiple visits to the Naval Hospital in Saigon to check in on SEAL Lieutenant John Bruton, who had earned a Silver Star in battle but was suffering from fatal wounds. The admiral arranged for Bruton's father and fiancée to fly to Vietnam and provided accommodation for them until Bruton died. Lieutenant Commander Roberta Hazard, who eventually achieved flag rank, served on Zumwalt's staff in Washington. She remembered when the admiral was being beaten about the head and shoulders over personnel and other contentious issues. Often when she accompanied the admiral as he exited the Pentagon, groups of enlisted sailors and junior officers would be there to say, Admiral, give it to him, we love you, you're doing great things for us. So he had compassion for his troops. His compassion for others did not end with his Navy service. Until his death, he worked at the national level to plead the case of veterans ravaged by Agent Orange exposure. He was convinced that his son Elmo contracted Agent Orange while fighting in the Mekong Delta on a swift boat. Zumwalt also worked to provide prostheses and wheelchairs to those needing them in post-war Vietnam. Founded the Merrill Foundation and worked with President Clinton to pass the Chemical Weapons Convention. In short, Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt, throughout his time in the Navy and as an American citizen, displayed the vision, courage, perseverance, and compassion to mark him as one of the truly great naval leaders of the 20th century. Thank you.
Well, good evening. We really, it'd be great to get some dialogue, I see, before everybody's running from the sinking ship, pun intended. So I'm going to defer my commentary and ask that those of you that want to ask a question start migrating down to the microphone. And it's important to Admiral Pandolf and myself that we get a dialogue. You folks came here tonight, and I think it's important that we talk about the things that you want to talk about. While that process is in place, my simple commentary would be, is it not a tribute, a great tribute, to the nation that we have and the government that we have throughout history, that we are able to choose leaders not based on some sort of caste in society, some sort of entitlement, some sort of royalty. We are able to choose the right leader for the right time. And I would tell you today that process is very much in place when we pick anything from service chiefs through senior admirals, generals, or whatever. Many of you may be familiar that General Marshall was really the right person by every stretch and every measurement to lead forces in Europe in World War II, but the president needed him in Washington, and that choice was the right choice, and Eisenhower went there to Europe. Eisenhower was a perfect president in a post-war period because that president knew and understood the perils of war and the atrocities of war, and who better to keep us out of a war? So if you're historians or students of history, you understand all that. These folks that we talked about today in an incredibly great series of presentations were there. They were given a mandate. They were the right people for the right time. They had what it took. They had persistence, they had moral courage, and they had a mandate, the backing of the people and the folks behind them, and it's astounding what can get done when you have that. So why don't we go to dialogue and ask you to come on down, grab the microphone, and we'll talk about those elements of the topics tonight or anything other that you want to talk about within the office of the CNO today, post Goldwater-Nichols. Should I pull this over for us? Yeah.
So who's got a question? All right. Please state your name and...
David Silby, Cornell University. There's a hint of, that I'd like everybody to comment on, of a generational shift from those folks, the leaders who had World War II experience and shared that in common, and those like Zumwalt who didn't have it at either the same level or with the same kind of experience. And I'm wondering if, I'd be very interested to hear from the historians, but also from the admirals, of when you lose that generational experience among the leadership, where they all know what they did, what you did during the war, Dad, how that affects the leadership, how that affects what happens with what you can do with the force, and how that affected especially Zumwalt, I think, when that experience disappears.
I can certainly speak to that in terms of Admiral Burke. One of the things that I had to leave out was the fact that when Burke became CNO, he knew almost all his seniors and subordinates because they served together largely in World War II or in Korea. The other thing that was really significant was he knew who they were, but he also knew their capabilities because they wore on their chests. In many cases, his deputy CNOs and his assistant CNOs were recipients of, almost all of them, were either the Navy Cross or the Silver Star. And even those who didn't were, like George Anderson, had a Bronze Star and a Legion of Merit with a Combat V. And so the fact is there was an understanding that came out of experiencing a broad, difficult, and hard naval war that made a serious difference. As a result, this is where the whole concept of in effect, the brotherhood of what he could do in terms of making this happen. People didn't resent him when they didn't make 3 stars. One of the things I also had to leave out was the fact that Burke actually was able to enunciate what the qualities were to make 3 stars, something, and write it, something you could never get away with today. for that reason, and that related to things like combat experience as well as the ability to command forces and so on. And he recognized that that was the case. Because I recall talking to him. I'd been at sea on the staff of Carrier Group 4 when Admiral Carl Trost was picked as CNO. And when I got back, we were talking, and he'd met Trost, and he knew him and all, and we were talking about how he's the right man, and he said, you know, I couldn't be CNO today. And I looked at him, and I said, what do you mean? And he said, and this is before Goldwater Nichols, and he said, it's too political. And I said, too political? You were taken off the promotion list by the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Navy. He says, I don't mean that kind of politics. It's too political. So that impact was significant.
I'm not quite sure I understand your question fully, but Carl Zumwalt had been in World War II. He had battle awards, and he was at Leyte Gulf. He witnessed Savo Island. But he was, in many ways, isolated from Maine Navy. He served in destroyers throughout the 50s, and then he worked for Paul Nitze in the Pentagon. And I don't think he built that same bond that, say, Tom Moore had with the aviators. They all knew him. They all served with him in capacities that were at a very high level, command experience. That was a common complaint of Admiral Zumwalt, was that he had never commanded 7 fleets, 6 fleet, any of the fleets. He had commanded in Vietnam. Now, his staff there was, well, Pete, maybe you can tell me, 100 people or so? I mean, so when he got to the Pentagon, rather than go to OPNAV, which has thousands, he went to a select few. So he was sort of isolating himself even there. And the fact that he became CNO over the heads of 33 other admirals did not endear him to those who weren't selected. So he created some of his own problems, unfortunately.
Let me just note, Burke did not actually have that problem, despite the fact being appointed over 92. When he was chosen, it turned out that Undersecretary of Navy Tom Gates and Assistant Secretary of Navy for Air, Jimmy Smith, had actually circulated a questionnaire to senior flags saying, who were the top 5 people who could become CNO? Burke's name was not at the top of every list, but he was on every list.
So to answer your question, I think Ernest King demonstrated the fact that he valued combat experience, but he valued somebody who had an educated approach to the question at hand. More importantly, he had people on his staff who did not have direct combat experience, and yet he relied on their recommendations in the Combat Intelligence Division that he created. And I would hasten to tell you that the people that were doing that work had not stepped aboard a ship or faced direct combat because those people were women of intelligence.
Yeah, I think that the legacy of the World War II officers really went up through Admiral Holloway, and it bore a great impact on our Navy. That said, I don't think those who came later were held in any less regard, or there was a break, a conceptual break as the leadership evolved. What mattered was that you were a fine officer who had proven yourself in service. As long as, and that was the case with all of our CNOs. So I really don't think that there was an us and them mentality between those who had served in the Second World War and those who hadn't as we moved into the post-Cold War period. Admiral Greener?
Since Goldwater Nichols, I don't think the subject is as relevant. We're going to go into war with geographical combat commanders commanding that, with the Secretary, working directly for the Secretary of Defense. However, under Goldwater Nichols, any individual who is a prospective chief of the service has to have served in a joint job as a flag officer, which should tell you, and all those involve some element of combat selected. Now, you may not be in combat, and that's just a function of what, the real world and how it works out. Lastly, I'd say my experience from as a CNO is you're kind of the CEO of the Navy, the Chief Executive Officer. You organize, train, equip, and man. That's a full-time job, And I think if you concentrate on that and those elements of it, you don't become a business person, but you have to think business-like. You have to be ready for the next war, and you have to be thinking in that direction. Too much time on the last one, as you know, you're fraught with making a mistake.
Please. Over here. Oh, great.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Midshipman Second Class Fugate. My question is for Dr. Meralda, I believe. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your time and apologize for my classmates who got up while you were speaking. That was disrespectful. And then my question is, what specific reforms did Zumwalt implement to improve attitudes towards women and minorities? And how did he ensure that that got done from such a high level of command?
I'm not sure I heard all that.
Oh, sorry. So what kinds of reforms did Zumwalt implement for women and minorities, changing the attitude towards them? And how did he get that done from such a high level of command?
Well, he enabled them to go to the National War College for one, and to get into the Naval Academy. That didn't happen then, but he started the work for it. And he was looking into women going to sea, just a broadening of the billets across the board. Some he succeeded on, others he did not. One of the problems, in fact, this was rather surprising, that when he began work to help women in the service, he ran into opposition from the female heads of the women in the Navy. Quigley, Robin Quigley, was the head of Navy women in the Navy. She opposed the fact that all the other services had women in Vietnam. The Navy only allowed 2 officers, female officers, to serve in Vietnam. And he was thinking of changing that to be in with the other services. And Quigley said, no, I'm against women being in a combat zone, being with too many men, other things. Very traditional approach. And he ran into that with her and her predecessor, the same thing. So he could only do so much. And now he did change things. Quigley did want to get rid of the name Waves. She said, Waves has not been legal, the term, since 1948. And so he did. He got rid of Waves, and he started calling officers women, just officers. And he went forward with some other things. They used to have a female detailer in Beaupers. And on her advice, they got rid of that detailer. They said, they're just women, will be like everyone else. It took a while to make that work. So there were a lot of bumps and grinds at that period. But he was trying. So he had opposition from males, and he had opposition from some female leaders. But he did start a lot of things that Jim Holloway, his successor, helped put it to fruition.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Randy Papadopoulos. I'm the Secretary Historian for the Department of the Navy, and my question is for the 2 admirals on the panel. You've heard about 3 of your predecessors, direct predecessors of you, Admiral Greenert, as Chief of Naval Operations. They served in times of war and after wars in 2 cases, in the case of both Admirals Burke and Zumwalt, as CNO. What would you have wanted to know from them that you didn't know when you stepped into your jobs as a flag officer? And I would ask Admiral Pandolf to comment on that too. I say that because I'm trying to communicate something to people of your rank, and I want to know what you want to know. Thank you.
So let me make sure I got the question. If I could have a conversation with them before taking the job, what would my question to them be?
What would you have wished you'd heard from them after you got the job?
How do you get things done in this town? What? And I mean that I perceived that I kept saying mandate, when I took the mic. And as I listened to these gentlemen, and I had the opportunity to read their summary beforehand, and I was taken by how, thank goodness this happened. Our nation was in existential inflection points in all of them, and I would include Zumwalt's time, because the fabric, go see Ken Burns' Vietnam again, and you say, man, we were coming apart at the seams in this nation. Nothing like, today is nothing compared to that. But here's my point. They were able to get things done and close it off. Now, Burke had more time, and he got a lot done. But it's understanding how does the town work. Don't go bumping your head against things like you're going through a maze. If I could do that, if I could have asked them that question, I think that might have been one of the more relatable things.
Right. My question would be very, very similar, perhaps less DC-centric, but it would be, how do you translate your vision into effective action? And, and what I would really like to hear from them is about how they handled the setbacks that they all experienced, which is very, very difficult. I think you talk about these officers and we listen to these eminent historians, the word perseverance keeps coming to mind. In all cases, King, Zumwalt, Burke, they had to swim upstream. They had a vision of what they wanted to do, but they couldn't achieve it 100%. They had to focus on certain areas and cut their losses in other areas, and the calculus by which you do that. When did they decide enough was enough, and when did they decide to press on through? I would have loved to hear them sort of elucidate their personal stories as to how they made that calculus and achieve the success that they did. Thank you for that question. Please.
My apologies. Hello, gentlemen. My name is Midshipman Fourth Class Otero. Thank you for your time. I had a question pertaining to Admiral King. Now, I apologize if I get anything wrong. I'm not as knowledgeable as the matter as you gentlemen, but it was my impression that he was actually quite the micromanager. I remember reading sources, a lot of combat commanders frequently being frustrated by King's, frequently butting in, coming to example, he was very adamant about the drive to Formosa in the Central Pacific rather than focusing on Okinawa or the Southern Pacific. And I could be incorrect, but also Operation Overlord, there was a lot of issues about getting landing craft because he felt that the Pacific should have been the focus. So I just would like your input, gentlemen. Thank you.
So you must have been in Portsmouth when I delivered the paper on Overlord. I'm kidding. Of course you weren't. Ernest King had a tremendous job on his hands in the Second World War. It was a global war of unprecedented scale. One of the innovations that King did create was the numbered fleet system. The reason why the numbered fleets were created was to communicate high-grade special intelligence in ways that, if you weren't cleared for those sources, in ways that you could act upon that information. So a lot of the frustration that the on-scene commanders articulated was derived from the fact they didn't understand where that information was coming from. And a lot of it was tactical level information. So I wouldn't call that micromanagement. I would call that trying to exploit material that you have that's available to you. The second thing I would say about what King was facing was, number one, you have a guy named Winston Churchill who has this dream of recreating the British Empire after the Second World War. But his boss was a guy named Franklin Roosevelt who had this idea that we should have a United Nations, and it's really a utopian vision with 4 policemen and all this kind of thing. But that was your desired end state as negotiated at Casablanca. King's job was to execute that. And there's only so many ships that you have available. We started with a fleet with roughly 300 ships in 1941, many of which were damaged in the attack at Pearl Harbor, one of which was sunk on Halloween night, 1941, the Reuben James, while King was in command of a quasi-war, undeclared. And he was the one who had the responsibility for managing the creation of a fleet that approached 7,000 warships. I mean, we can't even think or fathom 7,000 warships. Many of the people who were in command of those ships weren't in the Navy in 1941. You had to train them. So when you think about what we were capable of doing in 1941 terms, I would challenge you to think about how you would do it in the future when faced with similar circumstances. And that's your job as a naval officer. So.
Thank you, sir. Will do.
Thank you. Good question. Please.
Good evening. I've been hearing about this panel for the last 3 months from Commander B.J. Armstrong. He's been talking this thing up, and it did not disappoint. This was a very, very good panel. I'm glad I came. So one of the things that struck me right off the bat, oh, by the way, I'm Mark False. I'm the class of 57 postdoc here. I teach the Marine Corps history elective while I'm here. So one of the things that struck me, I did not know that Ernie King had 7 kids. So that's like having, imagine if you will, 4 kids, and then having 3 more, which to me is mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. And I got really fixed on that, and I'm sorry, I have to throw this open to the entire panel. Whoever's available to answer this question, I would really appreciate your input. I don't see Ernie King doing anything without someone watching his 7 kids. So and I think this is a pertinent question for the 12 midshipmen that are left in this room. They're going to go on and be leaders in either the Navy or the Marine Corps, is how to balance all of this responsibility with the very, very real, very, very close, extremely important family life that they're going to have. If gentlemen, if all of you could speak to it as much as you can, the role their family played in their careers and kind of stabilizing that part of their life so they can go on and do all of these things for their country and so forth. Thank you.
So thank you for that question. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. Ernest King had a family of 7 children, 6 daughters, 1 son who graduated here at the Naval Academy in the same class with the first African-American midshipman. 7 kids, 14 grandchildren. And I have to tell you, in my research, I refute Thomas Buell's interpretation of King's behavior on both medical grounds and also by the fact of just simple chronology. And what I would tell you is the behavioral depictions of King that Tom Buell gives us in his quote-unquote biography are true up until 1905, when King had come back from the Asiatic fleet and he was crawling up the gangway drunk, and the XO on the ship said, "Well, you're about to miss ship's movement and you're drunk, Mr. King. You're the best sailor in the Navy at sea." That was Hugh Rodman, by the way, who went on to command Battleship Division in First War. And Hugh Rodman put in his fitness report, recommend dismissal from the service. And the president of Naval War College was in charge of the retention board in 1905. And he actually made King read out his fitness reports to the board. And he said to King, "What would you have us do with you, Mr. King? You're a great sailor, but your behavior is not up to standard." According to Stockton, who was the president, King responded, "Well, you're the admiral, make a decision." So they did promote him to lieutenant, and they assigned him to the Naval Academy as the officer in charge of discipline. King talks about this as a defining moment in his career. He marries Maddie King the same year at West Point, and they go on to have 7 kids. During that period, King commanded 4 warships, qualified in submarines, and was chief of staff to the Atlantic Fleet in the First World War. And a lot of historians like to forget that these people have long lives before they get to the Second World War, before you have a Lady Gulf scenario. These guys have been in the service for a long time. And the Navy of King's day was a Navy that went through that period of Prohibition. His mentors, Sims and Mayo, were both famous teetotalers. And so the depictions of King, going out to the bars and all that, there's something there, but it was in an earlier period in his career. And everything that I've found is he was a consummate naval professional who upheld the standards the best he could. And I gave you that little quote from Robert Heinlein, who dedicated his first post-war science fiction book to Ernest King's grandson, which is interesting. I won't get into that. But I want to tell you, as part of my research, I also discovered that every place that the King family was posted, Ernest King purchased a house. And he moved his entire family there to wherever he was located. So family was an important thing to King, and it's been my privilege, actually, to get to know the families of the Kings and the Simses and the Jellicos. And, one of the fun things about being a historian is recognizing that what you're studying isn't dates and events, it's people that you're studying. And when you spend too much time with them, many of you who know me know that the ghost of King haunts me. As a former naval officer, I have held command as a reservist, and there have been times when I've had to think about, well, okay, what would my friend King do here? And that's why it's important for you to study these people and understand how they think, because you're going to be in that position too someday.
Well, I have one simple answer. Arleigh Burke never had any children. He met Roberta Gorsuch, who was a Christian Scientist from Lawrence, Kansas, who came with her parents to Washington, D.C. during the growth of the U.S. government. He met his youngster year. He began corresponding with her throughout that time. We have 200 letters of Midshipman Burke that tell that story. He married her the day he graduated the Naval Academy, when he was discouraged from doing so. JOs were actually prohibited after 1925 from doing that. And the thing that was very, very clear was the level of dedication that both Burkes had to the Navy, although they essentially had an agreement very early on. One, that Arleigh would have the Navy and Bobby would have Christian Science, and that neither would violate the other on that. And that lasted for 72 years of marriage and 75 years together. But Bobby was the First Lady of the Navy, and she did much to, in fact, pioneer, I would argue, what flag officers' wives today are expected or asked to do, or have volunteered to do for that reason. And she was deeply mourned when she passed away. There were almost as many people in the chapel here for her funeral as there were for his.
I actually have a Burke story and a Zumwalt story in that regard. Admiral Zumwalt used to come into Naval Historical Center back in the 1980s every Tuesday to have lunch, talk a little naval history, and then head home. And on several occasions, Bobby came with him. Admiral Burke, okay. Admiral Burke and Bobby would come in to the Naval Historical Center and take the entire staff of the archives, maybe 15 people, down to the Officers Club and treat us to lunch. And she'd go around the room with a bowl of goldfish, Pepperidge Farm goldfish, to every person. And that shows you what type of person she was. And they were absolutely devoted to one another. I have a famous picture of Arleigh Burke on their honeymoon, he and Bobby, and she has seaweed all over her head. They're in California. It's a great picture. The other, this relates to Admiral Zumwalt, that his family was his bedrock. His sustainment was his family. I've looked through a lot of pictures of Admiral Zumwalt. There are many out there, and almost everyone has his wife, Musa, with him. She went to official functions, unofficial functions. She was always there. His son, James, served in Vietnam in the Marine Corps. He's still with us. His son, Elmo, served as a CO of swift boats in the Mekong Delta, died from his exposure there. But he was very devoted to his family and vice versa. And I really think that was where his refuge. He was getting a tough time in command, but he could always go to his family.
I think that perceptive, fine lady got it right. You got to marry up.
I've been told that there's a bus waiting for you, so we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you for attending this evening. Thank you for your questions, and how about a round of applause for our speakers?